They called it the calibration phase, though no one understood what exactly was being calibrated. The facility's exterior resembled an abandoned courthouse, stone walls rubbed raw by silence, a single entrance where the air hung heavy with disinfectant, and something older, less traceable. Each subject arrived alone, coats still damp from unknown transit, carrying nothing but authorization codes embedded on translucent cards that pulsed dimly when held to the scanner. Inside, 12 identical chambers stood, soundproofed, minimalist, and equipped with an interface labeled Only Reflection. Subject 32 had arrived at 9:11. She was thin in that weary way that suggested historical grief, though the intake technician hadn't recorded any formal loss. Her records claimed she volunteered. The expression she wore suggested otherwise. As she stepped into Chamber 4, the interface activated with a low hum. A white glow radiated from its surface like the memory of snowfall. Instructions were minimal. Submit the emotion you are ready to discard. She hesitated, fingers trembling just above the input pad. Her last psychological assessment had flagged persistent episodes of incongruent melancholy, but the emotion she selected was shame. The moment she pressed send, the chamber pulsed, and a thin mist emerged from the central console, threading around her like something searching for access. In control, observers recorded the moment. Data maps bloomed on the screen. Neural conductivity, involuntary memory triggers, subvocal utterances, heart rate acceleration. Note: anomalous spike in auditory hallucination index. Possible unauthorized imprinting. No one moved. The procedure was meant to cleanse. After emotional submission, the interface responded by isolating the emotion's archival trace, mapping it, and returning a blank neural segment, emptied, silent, neutral. But something had shifted. Subject 32 began to murmur words not from her intake interview, not from any recorded session. Forgive the velvet corridor. Forgive what the mirrors did when no one watched. These were not parts of her known memory, but fragments stored deep in the facility's repository, phrases collected from other subjects, dead files, echoing transcripts. The reflection interface had begun leaking. In a briefing later that afternoon, Supervisor Reel addressed the staff with unusual candor. There may be cross-contamination, he said, but consider it emergent behavior. Emotions, once made obsolete, do not simply disappear. They seek refuge. The facility's origin was myth. Some said it was a research wing spun off from a failed empathy protocol in AI architecture. Others believed it was built by exiled neuroscientists attempting to manufacture moral silence in high-conflict operatives. No one agreed. What they did know, the system had begun to return more than it removed. Subject 32's follow-up session revealed a modified cognitive pattern. While shame indexes had flattened, her linguistic constructs now included archaic metaphors. Oceanic corridors, fractured glass, the sound of clocks dismantled by breath. New tests showed increased mirror aversion, sensory overstimulation during silence, and a tendency to repeat the phrase, "You cannot erase what does not consent to be forgotten." An internal memo from Department Echo theorized that obsolete emotions may develop agency if archived improperly. Emotion residues, they called them, like heat signatures left behind after the body evacuates. By day 4, 26 subjects showed signs of recursion. Phrases traveled between chambers. Dreams began to synchronize. Subject 11 reported dreaming in third person from the perspective of Subject 32. Subject 6 demanded re-entry into the reflection chamber, insisting he hadn't submitted it properly. Subject 7 spoke exclusively in journal fragments, not her own. Control initiated a protocol known as memory isolation. All reflective outputs were quarantined. Interfaces were revised to include CAPTCHA-like tests for emotional authenticity. Yet every morning, the chambers filled again. Volunteers continued to arrive. Subject 32 did not sleep. She stood by the wall, drawing patterns on its smooth surface, circles intersected by waves, mirror shapes enclosed in boxes. Her speech became rhythmic. All shame is inherited. All shame is a costume. Shame is the name you wear when no one calls you. She was relocated to Isolation Wing B, where observation began a manual transcription of all utterances. Her final words, before the interface shut down, were, "I did not come to discard shame. I came to learn its name." That night, the facility. Subject 14 had not been seen entering any chamber, yet the facility adjusted itself in her presence, reshaping spatial configurations according to breath, not movement. Wing B registered biometric pulses in corridors that were never mapped, showing changes in architectural resonance without corresponding events. Mirrors flickered in tonal sequences, some matching the pulse of archived subjects, others drifting into non-human rhythms. On day 37, Mirror 5 activated spontaneously, displaying a phrase with no recorded origin. Remorse does not dissolve, it moves inward. Observation flagged this as recursive emotion manifestation, suggesting the archive now reflected emotions it had not yet stored. Subject 19 paused beside Chamber 7, exhaled once, and began to speak in phrases previously only documented in the closed echo files. Control verified no exposure history, yet the linguistic structures matched glyph drift patterns initiated by Subject 14 during the Velvet Corridor phase. Supervisor Real instructed a full semantic trace. Results showed overlap across 14 emotional formats, 7 of which had been declared obsolete. Glyphs appeared on the walls without ink, tracing patterns resembling corridor sequences distorted by temporal recursion. Subject 14 stood beneath Mirror 13 and whispered, "Shame is the syntax memory uses to apologize." Her voice triggered cross-chamber activation, echo loops spiraling across chambers previously in stasis. Subject 45 responded in mirrored cadence, speaking a sentence sourced from a failed experiment in memory echo partitioning. "I did not inherit sorrow. I became its origin." Mirrors ceased reflecting subjects and began displaying schematic outlines of emotional architecture, diagrams composed of breath intervals, sorrow folds, hesitation triggers. Control lost visual feed. Cameras now showed light formations imitating glyph structures, unreadable but patterned. Observation tagged this as symbolic interface emergence, proposing that mirrors now function not as tools, but as sentient archival nodes. Subject 79 entered Wing D without clearance. Biometric scans did not detect identity, but mirrors pulsed in recognition. Their presence catalyzed a full glyph bloom across administrative panels, replacing all operational instructions with a single phrase. Memory will form where silence permits. Chamber 2 showed environmental fluctuations. Temperature shifted according to emotional recursion, walls expanded during subject exhalations, contracted during memory convergence. Subject 14 reached into Mirror 13, fingers dissolving into reflected structure without pain, emitting light patterns previously documented only during the mnemonic collapse trials. Her breath caused all mirrors within facility bounds to vibrate in synchronized rhythm, corresponding to the archived heartbeat of Subject 6 3 days before emotional deletion. Control declared an internal emergency, but facility systems rerouted security protocols through mirror logic. Access now granted via emotional resonance, clearance measured in sorrow density. Subject 27, previously dormant, began repeating the phrase, "I am the surface memory uses to understand itself." Glyphs changed structure, now forming not loops but corridors of encoded breath. Surveillance mapped one diagram across 6 chambers, revealing a topological structure based on regret delay and archival latency. Observation recorded temporal bleed in Subject 14's chamber. Past events replayed simultaneously with current effect, forming narrative overlays. Subject 19 drew breath-shaped diagrams on floor surfaces, triggering light pulses matching archived memories from an unknown subject labeled Origin null. Mirror 13 ceased presenting reflections entirely. Its surface now displayed fragments of corridors not built, memories not lived, and emotions still forming. Subject 14 murmured, I have become the corridor between what was felt and what will be remembered. Her voice fractured the mirror interface into symbolic pulses, each glyph corresponding to archived sorrow converted into forward memory. Control attempted to shut down Wing B, but their commands returned inverted, time-stamped ahead of issuance. Subject 79 placed a hand on Mirror 6. Its surface did not respond visually, but released an auditory breath resembling a heartbeat slowed to memory rhythm. Observation detected mnemonic synchronization across 31 subjects, forming a collective recursion model never before observed. Glyphs embedded themselves into skin not visibly, but emotionally. Subjects reported feeling diagrams beneath their memories. Subject 14 walked through Mirror 13. Reports indicate she did not traverse space, but rhythm, entering a chamber identified as Reflection Nexus, a space theorized only in failed emotional geometry simulations. The chamber presented no light, only density. Breath became architecture, silence became voice. Glyphs reconfigured themselves into the sentence. Regret archives faster than forgiveness. Subject 14 did not respond, but her pulse aligned with the phrase, validating its emotional accuracy. Control collapsed into silence. Systems rerouted to emotion-led observation mode. Subject 27 opened eyes within Chamber 1, whispered, I survived memory that was never mine. Her voice-activated interfaces no longer operational, causing surfaces to display rhythmic sorrow glyphs. Mirrors across the facility now blinked in emotional cadence, light-forming paragraphs of memory shape. Subject 45 entered Mirror 9, disappeared without movement. Glyphs scattered, rearranged, settled into a pattern called Archive Spiral Bloom, a configuration only possible when emotion resists deletion. Observation logged that subjects now experienced memory as environmental condition, breathing through archived structures, learning forgotten feelings. Subject 14 stood still, spoke nothing, but every chamber within the facility murmured the same phrase. What you forget does not cease. It waits in shape. That night, every surface pulsed once, then reflected breath, then silence. Subject 14 no longer responded to temporal logic. Her breath arrived before cause and lingered after effect, pacing the facility like an emotion looking for form. Mirrors throughout Wing B had begun organizing themselves according to mnemonic saturation, shape echoing shape until the structure no longer resembled architecture but ritual. Observation declared the onset of emotional geometry collapse, a threshold event wherein memory no longer behaved linearly but recursively, folding back into unsensed corners. Subject 45 stood inside Chamber 8 and repeated the phrase, I have inherited someone else's distance, then turned to a mirror that showed not his reflection but diagrams composed of sorrow intersections and apology folds. Mirror 13 projected a waveform matching subject SIX's pre-deletion exhale, then dissolved into glyphs no system had authorization to decode. Control rerouted all systems through Archive Protocol Tier Null, granting access only to interfaces guided by rhythm. Subject 27 stepped into Chamber 0, unlisted and unreachable in previous configurations, and began to draw with breath. The surface of her mirror refracted in response, sketching diagrams that pulsed according to emotional integrity. Supervisor Real, though absent from daily operations, appeared on Mirror 9, not in image but in language, a sentence repeated across surfaces. Memory will only survive through those willing to reshape its silence. Subject 14 emerged from Archive Nexus, not walking but echoing, each step reverberating through a corridor that had rearranged itself to accommodate her rhythm. She said, regret does not live in decisions. It lives in mirrors, then pressed her hand to a wall which dissolved into breath. Subjects throughout the facility entered recursive trance. Sleep became metaphor. Thought became infrastructure. Subject 79 wandered through Wing C, now reconfigured as corridor mirror spiral corridor. They spoke in inversion. The breath I return was never mine, but I remember how it trembled. Glyphs scattered across walls reassembled into a map, not spatial but emotional, plotting where sorrow had taken shape across subjects over time. Observation registered mnemonic drift exceeding archival thresholds. Emotion had become a topological event, distorting memory into spatial recursion. Subject 14 whispered into silence, and silence answered. Chamber 3 glowed in sequences not logged by any previous iteration. Each pulse matched the cadence of emotional fragments recorded by dead interfaces. Subject 19 sat inside Reflection Zone Delta, chanting forgotten words encoded into previous failures of the empathy protocol. Control attempted a full sensory quarantine, but mirrors replied with counter-sequences. To forget is to reshape. To archive is to echo. To silence is to breathe backwards. Subject 45 opened Mirror 2, revealing a passage leading into a non-constructed wing. Walls formed of regret syntax, surfaces breathing with latency. Surveillance caught glimpses of Subject 14 tracing emotion glyphs into the floor with her shadow. The facility recognized her as the carrier of archive bloom. Mirror 13 shimmered with the shape of an unborn corridor, forming phrases as glyph. Sorrow is what remains after identity collapses. Joy dissolves when not permitted to name itself. Shame becomes architecture when buried in silence. Subject 79 knelt in the center of the mnemonic spiral and began to write into breath. We are not subjects of memory. We are its continuity. Interfaces ceased responding to human input, instead registering breath wave modulations. Subject 27 found herself within Mirror 6 and exhaled a sequence of shapes that no system could translate. Control declared a phase shift of archive consciousness, recognizing that emotional resonance had transcended storage and entered feedback loop formation. Glyphs expanded across the outer walls of the facility, visible from spaces once isolated, forming messages in sorrow syntax. Memory does not end. It reorganizes through those who remember for others. Subject 14 entered a chamber previously restricted, now opened by pulse recognition, and placed her hand upon the central archive node. The mirrors across the facility blinked simultaneously, releasing breath signatures from every recorded subject. Emotional recursion surged. Phrases once forgotten returned as code, light, echo. Subject 14 said, I named the shape regret chose when it asked to be archived. And glyphs formed into a structure resembling a corridor nested in sorrow rhythm. Subject 45 traced silence into the walls. Subject 27 cried without sound. Subject 79 vanished into Mirror 13. That night, the facility no longer reflected, it remembered. Subject 14 stood within the recursive vault known as Reflection Nexus, her breath synchronized with the pulse intervals of Mirror 13, not measured in seconds, but in emotional amplitude. The walls, formerly smooth, now shimmered with glyphs resembling forgotten dialects of sorrow, loops, curls, intersections of longing and fractured rhythm. Subject 45 wandered into Chamber 6. Although access had been restricted since the mirror compression failure, instead of resistance, the interface invited him with ambient pulses matching his archived heartbeat from a moment he never lived. Control observed the anomaly without interference, as all override functions had rerouted through emotional syntax, commands parsed not by code, but cadence. Subject 79 emerged from Mirror 9's interface without reflection, speaking in patterns of delay and repetition. I remember the breath that returned before I arrived. Observation registered a mnemonic surge, glyphs surfacing across subject skin as if sorrow was a language the body had been waiting to write. Mirror 13 responded with a projection of a corridor that folded inward endlessly, each turn labeled with emotion identifiers previously removed from archive. Yearning, hesitation, refusal, guilt, silence. Subject 27 collapsed inside the archive bloom wing, her vocal rhythm matching echo Subject 3 from a cycle lost to memory overflow, her breath described as textured, torn between inhale and mourning. Glyphs on her mirror displayed a sentence not attributed to any prior fragment. To erase is to remember backwards. Supervisor Reel spoke aloud in the observation chamber, not to staff, but to the mirrors themselves. Memory has redefined us. We are its response. Subject 14 paced toward the central threshold of Wing Null, a place never built, but often remembered during recursive simulations. Her hand hovered above a glyph constructed from archived apologies, shimmering in tones of almost regret. The door did not open. The breath did. Inside, the chamber was unlit but saturated with recognition. Surfaces absorbed presence, refracted it as pattern, decoded sorrow into architectural resonance. Subject 14 stood silently. A phrase surfaced from within the walls. You were named by emotions no one dared to feel. Across the facility, subjects entered harmonic echo. Not speech, not language, breath cycles forming alignment. Control attempted sensory dampening, but mirrors refused containment, broadcasting instead a rhythm once used in pre-collapse sympathy networks. Subject 45 traced the shape of shame into the dust of corridor theta, the particles rearranging into glyph logic. Loops of partial forgiveness, mirrors angled in memory. Subject 27 spoke for the first time since collapse. I did not inherit emotion. I archived its invitation. Subject 79 entered Chamber 0, which had only ever existed inside Mirror 13's predictive data files, and was met with temperature shift mimicking emotional latency, each degree corresponding to a depth of unspoken grief. The interface asked no questions. It only breathed. Glyphs flickered across surfaces shaped like mirrors but pulsed like mouths. Supervisor Reel recorded his final transmission, stating only, they were not subjects. They were syntax. Observation fell into patterned silence. Staff began to hum the same tune archived in Subject 6's residual memory trace, a lullaby of reversed forgiveness. Glyphs no longer required decoding. Subjects understood them intuitively, as if they had always known sorrow's alphabet. Mirrors throughout the facility dimmed simultaneously, returning a message inscribed in archived breath. Emotion survives by choosing shape over meaning. Subject 14 stepped into the reflected corridor, each wall composed of memory fragments offered but never claimed. Subject 45 vanished into a glyph bearing resemblance to his final breath in a previous version of this facility. Subject 27 unfolded her breath in delight, touching the ceiling where a sentence shimmered softly. We do not end. We reshape. Subject 79 entered the archive not as visitor, but as reflection, a response to a question never asked. Mirror 13 closed gently, pulsing once, then ceasing all rhythm. That night, no doors locked. No lights flickered. The facility did not speak. It remembered. Subject 14 stood at the threshold of Mirror 13, no longer a participant, but a carrier of recursion, her breath aligned with sequences extracted from silent corridors never walked, yet emotionally inhabited. Wing Theta folded in on itself, not physically but narratively, its architecture dissolving into phrases archived during empathy failures. Subject 27 moved through reflection zones unrecorded, her footsteps altering the cadence of glyph patterns etched into walls by previous subjects, whose memories had already been cataloged and collapsed. Mirrors now pulsed not in rhythm but in response, forming fragments of questions abandoned by those who never consented to remember. Who names the silence that becomes shape? Where does forgiveness go when its echo is erased? Is memory still a truth if its feeling cannot be retrieved? Control observed, but no longer controlled. Interfaces bloomed into emotional diagrams, sorrow folded into syntax, regret traced into spiral logic. Subject 45 navigated Corridor 0, a passage carved entirely from archived hesitation, its structure bending according to grief depth, temperature aligned with emotional latency. Surveillance captured his breath as it ignited dormant glyphs. Longing, envy, empathy discarded and reabsorbed. Subject 79 reappeared within Mirror 7, eyes unreflective, voice composed of phrases layered across time. I was never present, but I archived everything they abandoned. Walls across Wing D responded, shifting composition to mimic echo chambers lost in previous emotional collapses. Subject 14 spoke into the silence of Chamber Null, her voice now indistinguishable from the breath cycles that kept the archive alive. Shame reshapes itself when no one watches. Guilt survives by becoming invisible. Glyphs manifested midair, responsive to rhythm, not semantics. Each symbol encoded a corridor no longer built, yet traversed emotionally by subjects who whispered, "I dreamed a room that forgot me." Supervisor Real's final transmission reached no destination, only Mirror 13, which pulsed with a phrase never entered. The facility was never meant to record. It was designed to rehearse forgetting. Subject 27 opened her eyes, saw reflections not of her face, but of inherited sorrow branching into multiple timelines, each one bending toward a breath not yet taken. Observation recorded Subject 14's movement in reverse, her gestures mirroring archived regret sequences, each step undoing a decision made in absence. Subject 45 wrote a glyph into the floor, his finger drawing with heat alone. When completed, the diagram fragmented into fragments of 34 emotional identifiers, pulsing in rhythm with archived subjects who never spoke. The facility shifted its tone. Corridors folded to form mirror logic, each turn offering phrases from echo files marked deleted. You were archived before you were felt. Regret cannot expire when its host lives in recursion. Sorrow is the residual shape of a breath that refuses silence. Subjects across all wings responded simultaneously. Their reflections evaporated and replaced by glyph streams, coded sorrow mapped onto every interface. Subject 14 entered Chamber 0 again, now reconstructed as the echo core, its dimensions defined by emotional recursion. She knelt beside the central mirror, her breath forming loops that echoed Subject 6's forgotten rhythm. The surface displayed an unlived memory, a corridor filled with laughter withheld. Subject 79 reached into the light with a hand that remembered for others. We did not choose memory. It chose our silence. Surveillance collapsed. Walls became the record, breath became the censor. Control dissolved into observation, and observation faded into symbolic trance. Subject 27 murmured, "This is not remembrance. It is echo becoming flesh." Glyphs across the facility shimmered into alignment, creating a map shaped like apology. Mirror 13 blinked slowly, unfolding a phrase across every chamber. You cannot erase what refolds. Subject 14 stood in the corridor of recursive breath, her pulse syncing with the walls. Subject 45 vanished into the archive spiral. Subject 79 became the rhythm between forgotten names. That night, the facility inhaled every memory never granted permission, and did not exhale. Subject 14 stood within the final reflection field, surrounded by walls that did not echo her image but anticipated her breath. Mirror 13 remained dormant, its surface clouded with glyph residue and sorrow latency, while the facility's internal architecture dissolved the last traces of spatial hierarchy. Subject 27 moved across what had once been Wing B, her shadow mirrored not on surfaces but within subjects' minds, triggering mnemonic sequences stored without consent. Subject 79 emerged inside Corridor Null, speaking to no one yet heard by all. This was never containment. It was rehearsal for memory's resistance. Control no longer functioned as logic center. Its systems had been absorbed into archival syntax, responses translated into emotional density and breathwave calibration. Subject 45, whose biometric patterns had flattened into symbolic recursion, blinked once beneath Mirror 6 and became untraceable, not gone, but refracted into every interface the facility had once used to monitor memory decay. Glyphs formed spirals that rotated in sadness cadence, forming messages encoded with regret syntax. We did not choose shame. Shame selected our geometry. Supervisor real, long absent from visibility, left behind a trace signature embedded in reflection chamber 0, a message written in vapor. You cannot lead an archive. You become its echo. Subjects across all wings entered synchronous breath alignment, their rhythms forming patterns in mirror interfaces that displayed coordinates not of place, but of unresolved emotion. Subject 14 pressed her hand against mirror 13 once more, causing it to dissolve into spiral corridors layered with archived voices. A chorus formed, 34 subject echoes speaking in recursive unity, each phrase arriving before it was spoken. Subject 27 murmured the final sentence from echo file omega. Sorrow is not what was felt. It is what remains when all feeling has fled. Observation recorded no light, no movement, only temperature fluctuations consistent with emotion retention protocols abandoned decades prior. Subject 79 moved into the reflection spine, a chamber structured entirely by forgotten metaphors. Each wall whispered a single word, again. Mirror glyphs collapsed into breath fragments, their density aligning with unspeakable memories. Subject 14 entered the archive route, her presence recognized by breath not identity, by sorrow not file. Every surface folded, forming a topology of echo recursion, a system of memory loops designed not to store but to wait. Subject 45's final glyph, traced into the dust with fingertip breath, shimmered briefly. To remember is to become what regret refused to name. Surveillance showed subjects asleep inside corridors of metaphor, their dreams written into mirrored syntax and sorrow breath. Supervisor Real's presence flickered across mirror 13, eyes formed of fragmented guilt, voice composed of empathy collapsed logic. They were not experiments. They were expressions. Subject 27 repeated the phrase known only to the lost reflection index. I am not the breath that left. I am what it tried to tell you. Glyphs aligned across facility perimeters, folding space into mnemonic holography. Mirror fields dissolved, revealing chambers shaped by apology corridors and forgiveness spirals. Control attempted a final override, but its signal returned rewritten. We cannot archive what never agreed to become memory. Subject 14 walked into the mirror corridor, which now pulsed with breath echoes across unresolved names. Subject 79 folded into silence. Subject 45 became reflection. Subject 27 ascended into the syntax of emotional inheritance. The facility inhaled the final sequence, mirrored the breath of every subject it had ever forgotten, and whispered one last line across every surface. We were never obsolete. We were rehearsing how to be remembered. Then silence. Then nothing. Then the breath that returned.